This is a continuation of the lecture that I began in class last week about the connection between rhetoric and discourse. I'll also discuss Deborah Tannen's essay, We Need a Higher Quality of Outrage. Finally, stick around if you'd like to hear me discuss what I mean by how does this paper make connections to the big picture, a phrase that you'll see over and over again on my rubrics as I assess your critical thinking. If you look at this slide of the rhetorical triangle, it presents an image that I hope you'll become familiar with by the end of our class. You probably discussed it with Professor Halstead. Remember that the triangle really just demonstrates the relationship between we as writers, our text, and our intended audience. Logos, ethos, and pathos are the classical rhetorical terms for words that are maybe more familiar or easier to use, meaning the rhetorical appeals, logic, ethics, and emotion. One thing that I wanted to make clear is that what you're seeing when you see this image is an example that gets repeated often in different composition classes. So for example, on page 327 of your argument textbook, you'll see this representation of the rhetorical triangle. When you see it in another context, I don't want you to get confused. Both images are based on Aristotle's 5th century BC version or discussion of what argument is and how it works. So you'll see here the author on page 327, Professor Scott Eric Kaufman, uses the words speaker, speech, audience to convey the same type of relationship. Although I didn't assign this article, What is Violent Rhetoric? It's actually pretty good to read if you have the chance, because what Professor Kaufman clarifies is the importance of the effect of the persuasion of the speaker on the audience. That's really what rhetoric is. It's an act of persuasion, and that's what makes argument. It's not just angry words, for example, or emotional words. There has to be a content or a structure that suggests that one might be persuaded. And the way that we persuade using rhetoric are through the appeals. So if you flip back in your textbook to page 63 to Deborah Tannen's essay, We Need Higher Quality Outrage. And I know this was chunky reading, a lot of big words to define. Deborah Tannen is actually employing rhetoric in order to persuade her audience that the American public's conversation about various contemporary issues is really not as controversial or oppositional as it could be. You probably noticed her keyword agonism because it was repeated so often. But I don't want you to be confused. She's not calling for more agonism. She's calling for more debate, actually, which she says that agonism prevents. So make sure that you go back and reread the essay if you need to figure out how she's defining it. She gives some examples, and similar to the documentary on misrepresentations of women in the media that we watched on the first day of class, she also points the finger at American journalists. So you'll see here on this slide, I have an image of an anchor from Fox News, which is one of the news channels that bears the brunt of, I would say, American criticism of highly controversial newscasts, a highly conservative newscast that often point the finger at the president or Democrats, for example. But the point that Deborah Tannen is trying to make is that we shouldn't look at a news station like Fox News and assume that because it's being critical that it's representing what she calls true opposition. You might think, for example, that Fox News plays on the same station as a lot of TV shows that would seem to contradict the very values that the news station represents or seems to uphold in its rhetoric. On the right side of the screen, you see an image of Jon Stewart, who is probably familiar to a lot of you. And The Daily Show is a very funny show. Jon Stewart criticizes American politics largely through satire. But again, one of the points that Deborah Tannen is making in this essay is that even when you have these alternative voices, that sometimes by presenting a mere pro and con of the issue of the day, it really doesn't help the American public to move beyond those two different sides, which she calls balance, to an alternative point of view. And that's what she's really concerned with. So, in the questions for reflecting and writing, you may have agreed with her list of problems, which are somewhat dated. You may have added on. But I really hope that you understand in question number 2, when the textbook is asking you if her objection to the balanced approach to reporting makes sense, that she is actually asking you to think about how many different points of view you get to exposed to through American media. Also, just kind of a quick reminder of the structure of a thesis statement. Deborah Tannen's thesis statement could probably be summarized as the following. It's on page 63. You might pick the first sentence if you wanted to quote her. I've kind of put together her thoughts to hit her main points. But you'll see that she definitely mentions a thing, right? Something that we need. She has a focus, right? And she makes a judgment. Agonism is what is obscuring true opposition. The connection between Deborah Tannen's essay, rhetoric, and our key term for this semester, discourse, is that Deborah Tannen is actually arguing that rhetoric and discourse are much more connected than maybe we think. So, for example, if I had to represent the relationship between discourse and rhetoric another way, Deborah Tannen might say that the large house that you see in the center of the screen is rhetoric. It's a message. It's the Fox News of a contemporary debate. It's familiar to us, it's larger than life at times, and we hear it a lot. But if you look around that central message, there are a lot of houses that look just like it. And if we look even broader, all of these messages are really residing in, let's say, the same neighborhood, which would be discourse. So, for example, even though Democrats and Republicans might disagree on an issue, largely both support, for example, democracy, capitalism. That would be the neighborhood in which their different budget strategies and policy reforms reside. Finally, I want to turn to a phrase that you'll see on a lot of the rubrics that I'll pass out in class, and that is, what's the big picture? The last slide hopefully starts to suggest a broader context for you to think about the arguments that you'll be making in our class. So when I ask you what's the big picture, and for you to draw some conclusions, I'm asking you to think about what our topic or your subject really means. What does it mean for you personally? What does it mean for those around you? What does it mean for our society? You can think locally in terms of Chicago and Chicago neighborhoods. You can think globally. If it helps, you might also want to turn to our guiding questions from class, and maybe in a sentence or two, try to answer one of these in relationship to the assignment. Again, I use big picture quite a lot, so it's good to be working out how you might answer or address that. Okay, I hope this was helpful.